I think one of the reasons atheism has become culturally prominent, which is a very weird thing historically. Atheism is a very new thing that was produced in modernity, if that makes sense, as a cultural phenomenon. Is that we have to recover this rich meaning of nature as purposeful, that we're a part of it, that there is a cosmos, that we're not reducible to random chance concatenations, and there's real meaning. I think that should be part of our way going forward.
Welcome to Actin Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. On today's episode, Acton librarian Dan Huger speaks with John Pinheiro, Director of Research at the Acton Institute, and Daniel Wagner, Chair of the Philosophy Department and Director of Catholic Studies at Aquinas College, about the election of Pope Leo XIV. Why is the election of an American pope so surprising? How is his choice of name significant? How will the legacy of Pope Leo XIII's in philosophy and Catholic social teaching and Pope Leo XIV's papacy? What are the new things of the 21st century that the new pope will address? You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Actin Line at acton.org/actinline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Actin Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by John Pinheiro, Director of Research at the Acton Institute, and Daniel Wagner, Chair of the Philosophy Department and Director of Catholic Studies at Aquinas College. We have a new pope, and today we'll be talking all about him. This past Sunday, writing in the Dispatch, I wrote, on the second day of the 2025 papal conclave, after the fourth rounds of votes had been tallied, white smoke appeared from the chimney of the Sistine Chapel a little after 6 p.m. in Rome. Bells rang out over St. Peter's Square, and in the ears of tens of thousands of faithful assembled there, Habemus Papam. Cardinal Dominique Francois Joseph Mamberti then emerged from within to announce that Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, a native of Chicago, had been elected pope and chosen the name Leo XIV. The new pontiff addressed the crowd with the words of Christ himself, "Peace be with you," a warm and welcoming change to a church anxious about its future since the passing of Pope Francis late last month. End quote. The election of Cardinal Prevost came as a shock to many, but Michael Severance in Religion and Liberty Online, writing actually the day the conclave just began, wrote, quote, "The other long shot, perhaps not so long shot, is Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, the American Augustinian, read super disciplined and serious. He is more than capable of cleaning up some of the messes Francis had encouraged inside and outside the Curia. More than anything else, he knows what makes for the right stuff of a good bishop, even the Bishop of Rome, as he is currently the prefect of the dicastery of bishops. Let's not forget his impressive resume includes his continuing to serve as the president of the Pontifical Commission for Latin America, his trilingual capacity in English, Spanish, and Italian. He was Bishop of Chiclano, Peru, for 8 years, from 2015 to 2023, and was even prior general of the Augustinians, and is as affable as Cardinal Dolan, charming the socks off his sheep and clergy under his leadership. Michael was very perceptive in those remarks. There were not a lot of folks who had Cardinal Prevost on their radar. John, Daniel, welcome to Actin Line. Thank you for being with us. And I guess we're going to open up with asking, were you surprised?
I was surprised for a number of reasons. One was he was not much on my radar as well, though I'm in contact with Michael Severance at Instituto Acton a lot. Number two, there were a number of papabili bandied about. He was certainly not one of them. And in fact, in the Cardinale magazine, which comes sent to me, I think they had 12 in this big fan, if you visualize a fan from left to right in different biographies, and he wasn't among many of them. And it just proves that old saying, of course, that if you enter the conclave a pope, you come out a cardinal. And he seems to have been surprised, but I would say he maybe was not that. I mean, if you come up with a coat of arms and a name and a number of other things quickly, you had to have thought about it a little bit. I would suspect just about every cardinal must think about the possibility a little bit.
One of Pope Leo's brothers in a series of what have been great memorable sort of interviews. One was, in his lazy chair in his Chicago living room talking about his brother, the Pope. And one of the brothers was talking about how they used to tease him growing up and that he had always wanted to become a priest. And they used to tease him saying, well, do you want to be the Pope? And well, he is now. Daniel, what was your reaction?
I too was surprised. I'd read several, pieces. I do not recall seeing his name mentioned, and then on top of that, him being the first American pope, that was a surprise to me for sure.
And that might be the most surprising thing in some ways, an American pope.
So we've had a Latin American pope, but this is our first North American pope and our first American pope. Why is that surprising?
Well, so this is just something that those who know the Vatican well, those who know politics inside and outside the Holy See well, and the image of America in the world as the preeminent military and financial power, the thinking had been for a long time that the Bishop of Rome ought not come from that most powerful nation. Now, this Pope, Leo, he spent so many years in Peru, of course, that he has dual citizenship in Peru, speaks flawless Spanish, was involved in the missions as part of the Augustinian order. So there's a way in which Peruvians are also claiming him as their own, and that makes him a very, very American pope. You mentioned North America, but a South American pope as well.
Yeah, a global pope for a global church. Daniel, what were your thoughts on this American angle in particular?
John maybe knows the numbers, but I mean, we have mostly Italians, right, historically. Do we get Germans ever?
We had Benedict recently.
The Benedict, so, right. And then, of course, I mean, John Paul II being Polish was a big deal too. So, just very surprising in terms of historically where the popes have come from.
Yeah, certainly the last several hundred years, most had come from Italy for, I think, obvious reasons, because the choice used to be that you want your bishop coming from your own diocese, or at least your own region of the world. So if all of the cardinals are Italian, they're more likely to pick an Italian, of course. But this is the Bishop of Rome, so maybe you want an Italian. But once this went to John Paul, it just hasn't gone back yet.
Yeah, and the makeup of the cardinals, and we talked about this in a previous podcast, this has been a lower percentage of Italian cardinals than we have had. This is an increasingly global collection of cardinals. So perhaps, I mean, we're still surprised, but this seems to be something that should be less and less surprising to the world, that we have popes coming from around the world. Now, one of the other interesting things is, the first thing we learn about the Pope, other than who he is the name he has taken as a Pope. And when he was announced as Pope Leo XIV. These names are significant. They're significant because they're chosen by the Pope. They're significant because there's a legacy associated with many of these names. Pope Francis was the first pope to be named Francis, but of course we have St. Francis of Assisi. We have a whole tradition of the Franciscan order that might be informing that. Leo, though, we've had a lot. This is 14. Pope Leo the 13th was a very long reigning pope, one of the church's longest reigning popes, and was very, very formative in shaping how the church addressed the modern world, both in its social teaching in Rerum Novarum and how it is going to engage, how it has chosen to engage the modern world philosophically with Aeterni Patris, and looking at how to formulate a Catholic response to the modern world, a philosophical response informed first and foremost by St. Thomas Aquinas and the sort of neo-scholastic revival that was encouraged by Pope Leo XIII in the 19th century. Daniel, we've talked. There's been a lot of talk about Rerum Novarum, and we'll talk about Rerum Novarum here. But there has been less talk about this philosophical legacy of Pope Leo XIII. And what is that legacy, and how do you think that might inform Pope Leo XIV as someone who is now extending that legacy further into the 21st century?
Yeah, great question. So I was very excited when I saw the name and really hoping that it was Leo XIII that was the inspiration, which he later confirmed. And so for me personally, this was very exciting. As I'm trained in the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, that's my area of study and work. And Leo XIII had, with Aeterni Patris, inspired the Catholic Church in its putting Thomas Aquinas' work at the forefront of education. In fact, he also made Thomas Aquinas the patron of education for us. So we have all these colleges, universities, and schools named after Aquinas. And I think that's really exciting. What he saw in the history of modernity is a slide, from late scholasticism through modern philosophy to very bad ideas, about philosophical anthropology. What does it mean to be a human person? What is nature? Materialism and positivism became very prominent, and then these philosophical, these are especially epistemological ideas, but they had an effect on moral life and culture. And in Aeterni Patris, the Pope talks about how this has basically infected the state and the social order, and he sees in Thomas Aquinas, I think, a response. And he uses, it's very Thomistic, encyclical. In Summa Contra Gentiles 1, Thomas sets out the role of the Catholic philosopher and theologian, and it's twofold. He says, we're supposed to express the truth, but also we need to refute error. He says we have to fight against error. And that is the approach, I think, that he takes in that encyclical. And of course, we have there's some targets that he has in mind, communism, socialism, and also a certain form of a kind of radically disordered capitalism, that starts a whole encyclical tradition in terms of social and economic teachings from the Church to protect, the common man and worker especially. But we continue to have more problems, and we have some pretty radical new issues that Leo XIV mentioned, right? And you might want to bring those up. But so I think this is very exciting that he chose this name, and that he wants to continue the Catholic and Thomistic legacy of saying the truth about reality, the good and the beautiful and the true, and especially using Thomas Aquinas as a model.
Yeah, John, one of our specialties here at the Acton Institute is the Church's social teaching, and this is where we spend a lot of time with Rerum Novarum, with Quadragesimo Anno, with Centesimus Annis, with all of this social tradition of the Church. What is it when you heard Leo? How did you think that this might inform social teaching, and what is that legacy of Rerum Novarum, and what are ways that it could be extended and developed further with now Pope Leo XIV?
I'll get to development in a moment, but when I heard the word Leo, the name Leo, I actually had a couple thoughts. One of them was, so he didn't pick John Paul III, but he also didn't pick Francis II. He picked Leo, which in many ways is a unifying figure because, as you say, at the Acton Institute, we draw a lot on Leo's work, but also the development of what he launched. So his Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum launched with Catholic social teaching. It's not that it didn't exist before, but it was clear in Leo and in his other encyclicals that he thought the church was an important player in society because the things that the church teaches about the human person impact how we're going to engage in exchange with each other and in our families and with our employer or with our employees. And so the church has much to say, that we don't just have. John Paul talks about this in Centesimus Annus. When his whole first chapter in Centesimus Annus, John Paul talks about Rerum Novarum and what was important about it and why he's celebrating the 100th anniversary of it. And that gets to the development idea. So modern Catholic social teaching might begin with Rerum Novarum, which was very concerned with the great questions of the 1890s, the question of the worker, the question of new types of property that they hadn't thought of before. Property had been thought of as land, but what happens when you think of property as capital? Is the right of private property important? Is it unimportant? What about the socialists? They seem to like the worker. Is socialism a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And if so, why? Can we have unions? Can we not have unions? What should Catholics think about these things? They're all very new questions. He calls them the new things. 40 years after that, Pius XI promulgated Quadragesimo Anno, where the principle of subsidiarity was developed further. And it's there in the work of Leo, but it's not there with the word subsidiarity. In fact, there was other terms used for it throughout the 19th century. And then came Mater et Magistra by Pope St. John the 23rd, and then finally some encyclicals on work in the 1970s, and then finally Centesimus Annus by Pope John Paul II. So this is a very long tradition, and Francis and Benedict both contributed to this as well. Yeah. So when I think when Leo the 14th takes the name after Leo the 13th, there's many things to keep in mind. There were 13 other Leos, not just one. He's the successor of Peter, not the successor of Francis. But all those other popes matter too, of course. I mean, there's some other really interesting Leos. I don't know if we'll talk about
Pope Leo the Great
today. So
well, you've got a great in the line. It's
great's pretty good. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I've just, there's no great after my name. I used to do that as a kid around the house. I'd be like, I like to be called John the Great. This is what happens when you let your kid read too much history, of course. But it never really stuck. But with Rerum Novarum, what we know is that Leo XIV specifically said, I'm inspired by Leo XIII and his social teaching, and we have many new things today, such as artificial intelligence and other things of what he calls a newer and different kind of industrial revolution, and the church must respond to those. And so I think that the kind of unifying, bridging figure that he's proved already, though it's too early to judge entirely, obviously, a pontificate. But I think that points to the wisdom even in the name, that this is somebody who the progressives might find something nervous about Leo XIII, maybe his Thomism applied to sexual morality, for example, but they might find things to admire his social teaching in the way they read it, in ways maybe I wouldn't read it in its long development. Conservatives might find some things to be concerned about in this Leo as well. And I think this is all a good thing. This is a pope who's trying to be pope and the bishop of Rome and the leader of the shepherd of the shepherds of the universal church.
So one of the things that I talked about in my piece for the Dispatch over the weekend was that these rigid categories of conservative, liberal, traditionalist, progressive, they break down when you talk about the sort of global context of the church. And you have a lot of folks in the wake of this appointment trying to project those sort of ideologies onto Pope Leo XIV. And, you'll see some folks, pitting Rerum Novarum against the free economy is one of the things you'll see from folks to the left. They'll say, see, he's interested in Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum is critical of capitalism. And I think the best guide to this for our listeners to think through is actually Centesimus Annus, because Pope St. John Paul II in that goes and sort of explains the reception of Rerum Novarum in the Church's social teaching, and there's a great excerpt where he talks sort of explicitly about that, where he says, Rerum Novarum is opposed to state control of the means of production, which would reduce every citizen to being a cog in the state machine. It is no less forceful in criticizing a concept of the state which completely excludes the economic sector from the state's range of interests and action. There is certainly a legitimate sphere of autonomy in economic life, which the state should not enter. The state, however, has the task of determining the juridical framework within which economic affairs are to be conducted, and thus of safeguarding the prerequisites of a free economy, which presumes a certain equality between the parties, such as that one party would not be so powerful as to practically to reduce the other to subservience. So the Church has long taught not simply all in on capitalism, not simply an emphatic rejection of socialism, and not some sort of nebulous third way, but in fact that but a subsidiary position of the economy as part of society. It has an important contribution to make, and the state has an important contribution in establishing this sort of strong juridical framework in which people act. So it's not a simple rah-rah capitalism, rah-rah socialism, but a rah-rah for a free economy in a free society. Which is, I think it's interesting how we often don't make those distinctions. John Paul II, also in Centesimus Annis, says, if by capitalism we mean this, then the Church has always rejected it. If by capitalism we mean this other thing, then the Church has always accepted it. And it's important to sort of read the Church's teaching through these documents in the Church's social teaching, and not to take our outside ideological categories and attempt to oppose them there. Let's talk about some of those other new things. John shared with me just shortly before the podcast a absolutely wonderful series of very, very short videos on the church and mass media that Catholic News Service put together, I think in 2012, in which Pope Leo XIV, then Cardinal Prevost, talks about the challenge of modern mass media to the Church's witness. John, could you give the audience a little, we'll include these in the show notes, but just give a little flavor of that argument, because it reflects a very sophisticated thinking through of these mass media questions in a very explicit way. We've had popes, of course, that have dealt with the media in various ways. Pope Pius XII, made radio addresses. Pope Leo XIII was, in fact, the first pope filmed, and is in fact the oldest person we have filmed. Actually, the films of Pope Leo XIII. He was born in 1820. And the film, I believe, is from the 1890s. But it's the oldest person we have on film is actually Pope Leo XIII. But this mass media has been a tricky thing for the Church to navigate. And we have a pope that has done some serious thinking about this.
So, mass media, that would encompass social media, newspapers, certainly, television. There are still people, I've heard, that watch television and not YouTube, etc. I haven't watched all the videos that I sent you, but I did watch the first one. And what struck me beyond the good production value of it, it kind of reminded me of the Poverty Cure video series, kind of short, to the point, easy to listen to, and very clear and concise. But what struck me is the recognition that there's ways in which, as we say in the baptismal rite, the glamour of talking about the glamour of evil, and there's certain lifestyles, choices, behaviors that are made to look very, very positive through the media, and yet they're very, very destructive, and they're contrary to who the human person is and what the gospel says. And Prevost is narrating these videos, and I imagine put them together. I don't know the history entirely of these videos yet. I do think we saw the downside of what can happen in media with Pope Francis. So when you have an X feed, a Twitter feed, that's very likely probably not Pope Francis tweeting out in the morning the way President Trump, I think, the way I read them, probably tweets out his own tweets by the looks of him.
Truth's out.
Yes. So I I think, that's only dangerous to the degree that the successor of Peter is called on to preserve and pass on the faith and be very concise and clear. And when you're tweeting in one place and giving interviews at another, and people can take the quotations and out of context, or maybe even in context, and things that end up less clear. So what's demanded in an age of mass media is discipline. And I see a lot of discipline so far in Pope Leo XIV. He's reading his homilies. He's refusing, for now anyway, I saw him shaking hands. He was refusing selfies, doing selfies. Apparently, so the news says, if it's to be believed, there's consideration of at least pausing those social media accounts in the Vatican. Because when you say something as a pope, there's not just Catholics listening. There's a reason why our Protestant brothers and sisters in Christ are paying attention to this papal election as well. This is an important moral voice in the world, and non-Christians as well. So you have to be careful what you say and how you say it. And maybe popes just need encyclicals and audiences and homilies. Maybe they don't need Twitter feeds and Instagram accounts.
Yeah. What do you make of this challenges of mass media, and how would you like to see, the Pope navigate that? Because that's a world that a Pope is many things. He's Bishop of Rome. He has universal ordinary jurisdiction over the church, but he's also a celebrity, whether he likes it or not. And it's a challenge to navigate that.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to what John said, but I think, contemporary mass media maybe tends to touch on our baser desires. Being provocative, right, allows you to sell more ads, etc. So, and this lends itself to, like John was saying, releasing or not contextualizing statements properly. I don't know how many times I got a call from someone during Pope Francis' pontificate, hey, he said this thing on this plane, or, what does he mean here? It sounds like it's contradicting, official church teaching, and then I have to go look, and, that wasn't the case. But this is because something's been taken out of context, if that makes sense. So I like the fact that he's being very careful about how he uses social media, and I'm very pleased to hear about this series. I'll have to check it out from 2012. That's cool.
Yeah, it's very short, but it's very thought provoking, and it's
But the flip side of this is that evangelization is the mission of the church, and Leo XIII made it clear, and Pope John Paul II in Centesimus Annus makes it very clear. Catholic social teaching is part of that evangelical message. It's not like a side mission or a side hobby. It's part of the mission itself. So what I think I've heard Pope Leo XIV say is that these questions need to be asked and explored. So this isn't like a 19th century anathema on mass media, but it's what's it for, what damage is it doing, and maybe what good can we do through it. We're just done talking about films, after all, that we watched on YouTube.
Yeah. I think this is one of the things, if you look, he talks in that film series, he talks about how the church needs to move to not simply offer a counter spectacle, but to invite people into mystery. And this is the temptation of the church to respond in kind to a culture of spectacle, a culture of celebrity. And the problem with that is that directs people to the world. And the church should be pointing people sometimes through the world in concrete ways like Catholic social teaching, and sometimes in a more directly transcendent way through prayer, through interior life, beyond the world and back to God. It should be pointing to God in the world and God beyond the world. And you can't do that if you're preoccupied with offering a counter spectacle. And it involves being genuinely countercultural. And that is a tricky business to navigate, particularly for a global church.
Yeah, Daniel, could you communicate communicate the Summa in 152 characters at a time. I mean, these concepts, I think, are much more difficult.
Yeah,
right?
indeed. Yeah.
So one of these questions. I mean, this is part of Pope Leo XIV's background is as a missionary originally in Peru, and I guess this is the occasion. Right now, everyone is focusing on what the Pope is doing, what the Pope is saying, trying to speculate on what kind of papacy this will be. And I think, he's very interested in the Church's witness and being that sort of witness in the world. And this involves addressing sort of the new things of the world. This is AI. This is all of these challenges that we're facing. We've got drone warfare. We've got all sorts of modern questions. Leo was struggling with, what does it mean when property is not just land but now capital? We're dealing with a similar changing world. And Leo went back to look at those Thomistic resources to address those questions. And those resources are all still there, ready for us to apply to these new problems. Daniel, what do you think are maybe some constructive ways that the Pope could help the Church think through these in the coming years?
Yeah, great question. And I think here this goes back to some things we've already said about his choice for the name Leo, and going all the way back to Rerum Novarum. In that encyclical, the Pope is very clear that the point of the state is to set up the conditions for human flourishing, both in naturalistic terms, the cardinal virtues, the expression of the cardinal virtues, and then for that that requires leisure in and of itself, but we also want that leisure for what's most important, spiritual perfection. So I think this is a great roadmap for us to think about how we're going to deal with new technology, especially with AI. New technology can be fantastic and wonderful, and that's when we use it to enhance human flourishing. But it can also have negative effects, and I think AI is an example where this could be very problematic for human flourishing, specifically because, so here I think you go a little bit into the background of where Pope Leo XIII was coming from as a Thomist and an Aristotelian. And in particular, I think here of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Human happiness requires deliberate choice to exercise the virtues. It's an action, right? Mm-hmm. The term Aristotle uses is ergon. So we cannot be happy unless we act, right? Specifically, we need to act in ways that are perfective of the human capacities. That's true naturalistically, and it's true in spiritual terms. So, Aristotle's basic approach has been confirmed. I think of psychologists like Seligman, who has done, and his students who have done empirical studies to show it turns out, Aristotle's right, human beings just are not happy when they're not doing things, specifically perfective things. I also think of Andrew Crawford here, who's done this work to show the importance of actual, the exercise of the intellect in connection with perfective physical capacities, work with our hands, So a reason, and in education we see this now, we're having a lot of students using AI, ChatGPT, etc. It was already a problem just with what Google can do for you, Yeah. And the issue is they haven't formed basic intellectual habits, virtues that have to do with writing, and the intellectual life, right? And they're using these tools. They're effectively doing the work for them, right? You see, the problem here is these are perfective activities, these works that would make these young folks happy, right? They would bring them happiness in an objective sense, but they're now not doing those things. This is the concern with, I think, especially for me, with AI, is that if we replace human For most human beings, their source of fulfillment and perfection is the good work that they do to contribute to society so that we can all flourish together, right? So if you add a new technology, you automate everything, use AI, you have less and less activities that human beings can engage in order to obtain fulfillment and be meaningful participants in society. So it could be great. I mean, if we replace labor with leisure activities, for example, if we had the resources so that, okay, well, you're not going to have to, work as hard to produce food and shelter and clothing. That's fantastic if we are kind of ahead of ourselves and we replace that with meaningful leisure activities, reading, writing, playing musical instrument, this kind of thing. So I think that Leo XIV, again, by choosing this name and this source of inspiration, to me suggests he sees this kind of thing as highly problematic, and we need to address it. So I think that's very cool.
Yeah, one of the things, when you look at, why is it that you don't just produce the paper on Thomas Aquinas to produce the paper on Thomas Aquinas to give to your professor to check a box, but what your professor wants you to do is actually engaging in a process of thinking and writing that leads to you realizing your capacities as a thinking and reasoning individual. The paper is really, in the case of education, it's explicitly beside the point. If the professor could this is merely the exercise that is to get you to cultivate these virtues. And every human activity has that dimension to it. And in education, it's most acute because so often assessments are poorly designed and beside the point. And students will be, we all naturally have, a sort of sloth and indolence and vices that we're seeking to overcome. And this makes those things easier and those temptations greater. And is really a big challenge in education. John, what are your thoughts on some of these new things and the sort of approach that Pope Leo XIV might take in addressing them?
Well, when Leo XIII talked about new things, what he was doing in essence was joining the fray. Mm-hmm. The socialists had already talked about the workers, but Leo XIII identified in socialism things contrary to private property and human nature, etc. And so here's what the church has to offer. So let's take artificial intelligence for a moment, which Daniel mentioned. Tools can be a very good thing. Water wheels, I mean, you name it. I think of the Benedictine monks in medieval Europe who began to think about the difference between drudgery on the one hand, which certainly pagans and slave-owning societies had identified almost all work as drudgery, and so they wanted slaves to do it because they didn't think it was rewarding or good in any way. And then the kind of labor that Daniel's describing, where it's good and you're growing in virtue. Human action, to coin a phrase, right? So that kind of acting in perfective things, as Daniel said. So what we need to do is explore artificial intelligence and its capabilities and what it can do and can't do. Is it really all that different to request that Grok, say, draft a letter for you than asking an administrative assistant to do that? Have you not just freed up his or her work to do something else? That's very different, it seems to me. Or asking it to say, show me all the Pope Leos and tell me the greatest critiques and the greatest accomplishments and who was involved in which one was involved in the Great Schism, and there was one. Which one crowned Charlemagne, etc. What was so great about Leo the Great? So you could ask those kinds of questions, and you're kind of employing. You're employing the computer to scrape the internet and do some research for you. That's very different than asking it to answer a paper for you, like a student plagiarizing or going straight to Spark Notes. And not only have they not learned anything, they've also engaged in vice by learning how to cheat and deepening cheating and lying that this work is theirs and not somebody else's. And as Daniel said, here's one more area of life where they can't grow in virtue. So that's very interesting to me what Daniel said. That is this idea that you're shrinking the amount of your life where you can engage in either true leisure or virtue-building activities. And so to parse that and really think about that, I think is something that we need to be doing.
Yeah, Daniel.
Just one thing I would add. I was at a conference last year put on by the American Catholic Philosophical Association, and the Lyceum Institute had a session there, and we had this discussion of about technology, and figuring out when does it have a negative effect, and when is it okay and actually helpful and good. And one of the things we kind of honed in on is a way to think about this is when the technology, when the intellectual virtue or the habit that we need to form is already formed. This is when technology can be super useful and helpful for us and not bad. It's when we haven't formed the habits properly and then the tool is actually doing the thinking, the working, whatever it is, for us. And so we're not working with it to actually express higher levels of virtue and goodness. It's doing it for us. And this is actually counter, I think, our approach to human perfection and education. So, this is why, I use, a classic example would be just a calculator, right? We give that tool to students at a certain point in their education, which is after they can already perform the functions the calculator's performing. This speeds up their activity so they can do more complex kind of calculating, if that makes sense. And so it doesn't diminish their achievements in terms of the expression of virtue. It's actually enhancing it. So I think there's a big difference between, say, someone that's a college professor and a writer for a long time using ChatGPT or one of these other large language model tools to speed up the writing process, and a freshman in college or a high school student, because these younger folks have not formed those basic habits yet that are perfective of them, if that makes sense.
There's even a beauty question here worth exploring, where I know artists, particularly some illustrators who work in Hollywood and in other industries where illustrations are needed, and they hate AI because they think that their work is being stolen and smushed together to create, J.D. Vance eating a burrito or something. And these are the kind of memes and pictures all over. I'm looking right at Dan because I know you made one.
I may or may not have done this.
But the point is, so the question of what is art, and getting into the question of beauty, that's an interesting question here as well. Is what AI do? Is that art? Can only humans create art? I have my own answers for this, but again, just like Thomas Aquinas, these are questions worth asking, and we're created to ask these questions and to seek the truth and the best answers possible. And I think this is something very exciting about the start of Leo's pontificate for me, that he's actually asking these questions. He's not just coming out and saying, I have all the answers, but he's looking to explore these things.
So one of the things that I always hold in tension is I believe, fundamentally I think that all work is meaningful or can be meaningful, and that we can bring our human capacities and our devotion to God, and we can offer anything to God, anything that we do, even seemingly meaningless work. But the tension I hold is that I also have no problem with meaningless work being done by robots. I don't think we should bring out the washboard and the big basin. I think the washing machine is good, but I think there's a problem if you load the washing machine up and then for the next half hour you're looking at TikTok until it's done, and then you move it to the dryer, and then you watch TikTok for another hour.
So we need to read Pieper. Yeah,
it's what do you do in those spaces that are created? Where is this a question where you can choose work that is actually more suited to your capacities and more able, and you are able to develop greater excellence? Because I can tell you right now, hand washing clothing is I'm not good at it. I could conceivably get better at it, but there are other excellences and capacities that I think could be better used with that time. But it's also, I have a duty to cultivate those things and to not just, there are also things that I've done when I've thrown those clothes in the washer that have been less valuable than maybe even hand washing those clothes is when I check Twitter and do those sorts of things. And these are complicated questions that you have to think through. And one of the things I also wanted to ask you both about is how should the Pope model thinking through these things? We've talked a little bit about the substance, like what does it look like to teach, to address these problems in a way that not only, sophisticated theologians can understand, but in a way that people in the pews who might be thinking, I can't wait till Mass is over so I can get on TikTok. Like, how do you get those? I mean, these are challenges that real people face in the church, and faithful people. These are real temptations in the world that even really faithful Catholics grapple with. And how do you make it real for them? And how do you make it transformative for them? And what's the Pope's role in that? And then what's our role in all of that? Because we all have things to contribute in our own contexts, in our own ways.
Yeah, great question. That's a big one. I think we start by identifying the problem, which you just touched on with your clothes washing example, so the reason, and when I was speaking about why I think AI will be problematic, and it does scare me. Well, part of the problem is that we have a culture now in modern society where we don't value, like John said, referencing Pever, what real leisure is, skole, where we get the term school, right? Real leisure in the classical tradition is about the expression of the virtues and the intellectual virtues in particular. And so when we get free time, we don't do that anymore. And, leisure for us means something quite different often now. So partying, it tends to be more hedonistic, right? Or we just do nothing. Okay. So I think I would just, I'm going to speak more theoretically here. Yeah. I think that we need to identify that problem, and there's evidence. I don't think the case is hard to make that this has contributed to a lack of meaning for modern folks. Depression, anxiety, stress, nihilism is just rampant. And so the problem is that usually when people are in a state like that, they're willing to listen to an account that might help them, right? That might be healing. So I think that might be an approach that could be taken by a pope, to reach out to that group of people who is constantly, screaming about this kind of pain and suffering because something is missing. And what's missing is, I think, a proper use of leisure time, the expression of virtue and spiritual perfection especially. And that's our ultimate point in this world. And just at a theoretical level, I would say that we have to, I think of St. Pope John Paul II's Fides et Ratio. We need to go back to knowing who we are. The Greek maxim noti se auton. Like, we've forgotten who we are and what's good for us and perfective for us. So I think philosophical anthropology, what does it mean to be a human being, is so important to try to help people in this condition. And of course, I think of Plato's theory of the allegory of the cave, because what the folks down there at the bottom are, they're tethered to the ground. They're looking at the back wall, right? This is the many, or hoi polloi. What they're shown is a false image of who they are, and this goes back to the mass media point. That's we present something that's not true about who we are, and then we're not consequently doing the things we should be doing in order to be happy, flourishing people. So I don't know if that's a start to answer your question, but.
Yeah. John, what do you think? How do we get this at the ground level? Or what can the Pope do, and what are the limits of what the Pope can do?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of limits to what the Pope can do. So the papacy ought to be laying out broad principles that then, in our own contexts and places and questions, we're then applying. And so one thing we need to do when we consider questions like this is realize that our interlocutors might be applying those same principles, and prudentially we're reaching slightly different conclusions, and we need to be aware of that. I think this is something Thomas Aquinas was really good at, that is trying to present your opponent's arguments or objections in their most positive, strongest light possible. And I think it's just very difficult to speak now the gospel and the truth about the human person simply because the overwhelming majority of media preaches something the opposite. And I know it was in Pope Leo XIV's first homily. I don't think I have it in front of me, but he talked in his first homily that he delivered about how difficult it is in some places to preach the gospel, but how we have to do it anyway. And the gospel very much impacts who the human person is. Oh, so here, I'll quote him. I do have it in my notes. He says, there's many settings, this is Leo XIV, there's many settings in which the Christian faith is considered absurd, meant for the weak and unintelligent. Settings where other securities are preferred, like technology, money, success, power, or pleasure. These are the contexts where it is not easy to preach the gospel and bear witness to its truth, where believers are mocked, opposed, despised, or at best tolerated and pitied. Yet precisely for this reason, they are the places where our missionary outreach is desperately needed. And he says this is because the lack of faith leads to a loss of the meaning of life, which gets to Daniel's point, like who is the human person and what is our purpose and why were we created? And what would our exchange with each other look like if we were paying attention to our nature as human beings? What does our nature have to say, for instance, about property or our use of property? And what does our nature have to say about our relationship with others? What does it have to say about the proper boundaries of the state? And so there's the moral and anthropological questions are very, very much joined on this. And I think the Pope's role is to bring up these questions and to be, I'd say, a fair interlocutor who can gather folks together to speak on this, but while also promoting the gospel. I think what you don't do is just try to mimic the world or try to go out of your way to water down or obscure the more difficult things that Christ and Scripture might have to say because the world's not ready to accept those. I think that's exactly the wrong way to do it, in other words. Kind of that bad kind of ecumenism where the only reason we can talk to each other is because we don't really believe in anything, so we get along.
It's been a stumbling block for a long time. That's not a new. I mean, it's an ancient.
Think of Augustine trying to go through all of his permutations, looking for the truth, or if you read the pagans who were arguing against the early church fathers, they're extremely learned men. I mean, they're not stupid. They're not just they're not out there just dancing around a tree somewhere in Northern Europe. I mean, these are really learned philosophical people who sometimes even mock the what they see as a Christian philosophers arguing against him. This kind of argumentation has been around for a long time, but the truth will out ultimately. We have to trust, I think, in the truth and in the faculty of reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I could add one more thing in line with what John's saying. So I think of Scripture, one thing that comes out is that what's revealed to us is that God has created a world that's rich with meaning, and we are imago Dei, made in the image and likeness of God. And this is, in the Genesis account, and then in the Book of Wisdom, there's a description of the meaningful movements, the seasons, the way that animals and plants reproduce, how we can observe it, and how we can see God in that also. And of course, you have the Romans passage from St. Paul, right, where he says that we can know the invisible things of God through the visible things of creation. And again, this is one of the reasons I love that he picked Leo is his name again, because we have this false dichotomy, between science now and religion. And so you have folks like Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking and Carroll and other, they're mostly scientists doing philosophy of science, and they're atheistic. And I think this is the context in which you get this idea that religion is absurd, Christianity is absurd. We don't need it anymore, because these folks reduce knowledge to quantity and extended stuff that we can see and touch, right? It's a kind of radical form of empiricism. I'll call it materialism or positivism. And no other kind of knowledge counts, right? And I think Thomas Aquinas, provides a solution for this, and there are many working in that tradition to show that actually there is an integration of faith and reason, and that the idea that you can reduce reality to material parts is actually incoherent and absurd. But you find in these atheistic philosophers, the common theme is there is no meaning to them. They say you can, Hawkins does this, Dawkins does it, other philosophers do this, where you have to make it up yourself, right? And I think that one way forward is to recover the view of nature as inherently meaningful, and that view, and I want to say that I think one of the reasons atheism has become culturally prominent, which is a very weird thing historically. Atheism is a very new thing that was produced in modernity, if that makes sense, as a cultural phenomenon. Is that we have to recover this rich meaning of nature as purposeful, that we're a part of it, that there is a cosmos, that we're not reducible to random chance concatenations, and there's real meaning. I think that should be part of our way going forward, to help a nihilistic culture, basically.
Peter Berger, the conservative sociologist of religion, wrote a book called The Sacred Canopy that is wonderful, and he talks about religion in terms of, plausibility structures, that religion is sort of pre-evangelization. The necessary foundation of any evangelical effort is to contextualize something in such a way that the gospel seems plausible, that it seems like something that modern men and modern women can accept, that they can find meaning with, that they can find consonant with reason, their own experience, and that crafting that invitation to faith in a contextually sensitive, in a theologically rich, and in a reasonable way would be, you can't ask for a better vision for a papacy than that. And it remains a challenge, and one that I think Pope Leo XIV has some ideas and some contributions to make towards that. Thank you so much for being with us, John, Daniel, for Actin Line. Thank you, listeners, and we invite you to this pre-evangelistic task as well.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important because it lets us know what topics you are interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@actin.org. Until next week, for Actin Line, I'm Mark Townsend.